Hello and welcome. It's Wednesday, October 27th here in Korea. Charting a road out of the pandemic includes paving a fresh path for productive working arrangements as well. Accordingly, we explore these options in today's broadcast. We start now with the broader pandemic coverage with our Kwon So-ah. Now, so let's start with the rather unsettling surge in Korea's daily tally for this Wednesday.
Right, Sunny. We're seeing a surge by 686 infections compared to a day before, bringing us close to the 2,000 mark again. To be exact, 1,952 infections were reported as of 12 a.m. this Wednesday, and that includes 1,930 domestic transmissions and 22 cases from abroad. Now, following a slight uptick from Monday to Tuesday, now we're seeing this huge jump here this Wednesday, and this is not only concerning because we usually have a higher number on Wednesday, but also if we go over to our next graph, it is actually a surge compared to the past weeks, as you can see. And with that, the average number of domestic transmissions here in the nation has now surpassed 1,400. For a closer look at where these new resurgences have occurred this Wednesday, the capital Seoul and Gyeonggi-do province are seeing a rise by over 300 cases from yesterday. Incheon is back to the triple digits. Also a resurgence in Gyeongsang-Namdo province, Gyeongsang-Bukdo province, as well as the city of Busan. Now let's move over to our total numbers here. 356,305 accumulated cases here in the nation, with 9 additional deaths, raising the death rate, the death toll, that is, to 2,797. Vaccinations are in progress. So we've got 71.5% of the nation's population fully vaccinated, with almost 280,000 having received their second dose a day ago. Let's also move over to figures abroad. We've got a little more than 457,800 new infections reported in the span of 24 hours and more than 8,500 fatalities. The UK is still seeing more than 43,000 infections reported in the past day, with the total standing at 8.8 million. Turkey at 7.9 million reported close to 30,000 infections in the span of a day. And if we move over to some specific countries here, these are countries that are seeing low vaccination rates, and a record high daily death toll was reported in these countries on Tuesday local time, with over 1,100 new deaths in Russia and also more than 700 deaths reported in a day in Ukraine, and also Bulgaria has posted more than 300 fatalities in just a day on Tuesday local time. And here you can see the total number of fatalities. I will get back to the exact number of the deaths in these countries in a bit. But before that, I'll toss it back to Sunny.
Right, so thank you for now. See you later. Right, now come next Monday, a number of establishments here in the country deemed high risk will require proof of vaccination for access. For more, I have Choi Min-jung here in the studio with me. Min-jung, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Right then, first, what option is there for those who are unvaccinated?
Well, if you're not vaccinated, then you will have to have a negative PCR test. And this also applies to those who only received the first shot of a 2-dose vaccine like Pfizer's or Moderna's. And even if you got your second dose, at least 2 weeks must have passed. Otherwise, you would also be required to get a PCR test. In order for the results to be valid, they must be tested within the previous 48 hours. Regarding PCR tests, authorities are expecting a spike in the number of people getting tested, as cases are expected to rise amid the lifting of many restrictions. To prevent overcrowding, they are considering a PCR testing fee, but the test will remain free of charge for the time being. Besides this, there were also some confusions as to whether a vaccine pass is needed to enter hospitals. Health authorities on Tuesday clarified that people will not need one when going to see the doctor. However, vaccine passes will be mandatory for visitations and also for caregivers.
Right, so caregivers and visitations to these medical centers. Min-jung, what is this also applicable then to those who are younger than 18?
Right, so for those who are younger than 18 or people who cannot get vaccinated due to underlying health issues, they will have to get tested negative for COVID-19 prior to visiting the hospitals to meet a patient or to look after the patient. But as we mentioned yesterday, they will still be exempt from entering high-risk facilities like singing rooms or fitness centers.
Right, I see. All right, Min-jung, overseas then, I understand the US has tightened its travel requirements with Korea.
Right, so the U.S. has bumped up its travel advisory for South Korea to level 3. This means that people visiting from the United States should reconsider travel to Korea. It's the second highest level in its 4-tier system. And this indicates that there's a serious outbreak from COVID-19 from the viewpoint of the U.S. It was upgraded from level 1 to level 2 in August when the 4th wave of infections broke out here in Korea. For Korean nationals entering the U.S., they will now need a vaccine pass. Up until now, only negative test results had been required. But with these latest changes, only fully vaccinated travelers will be allowed to enter the U.S. starting on November 8th. Meanwhile, the WHO Emergency Committee insists that countries should not require proof of vaccination as the only condition for international travel. They recommend making changes to testing or quarantine requirements instead, as many countries do not have equal access to vaccines.
Right, which of course is a very valid point. All right, Min-jung, thank you for now, but stay behind for the extended talk with Soa.
Thank you.
Right, now we turn to our Kwon Soa, who is going to fill us in on the latest government remarks regarding our COVID-19 situation for this Wednesday. Right, Soa?
Right, Sunny, and we will start with an assessment of the rise in cases this Wednesday that we're seeing with close to 2,000 infections. Now, officials say that they still have to monitor the rest of the week and the following days and weeks ahead to say whether this is surely a rising trend. However, they have been mentioning that recently, for the past 3 weeks, there was a slowing down trend. So they are seeing signs of a rebound at this point. And officials are citing comprehensive factors to this recent increase. Here's more by a senior health ministry official, Son Young-hae.
We believe the easing of many rules regarding prevention and social gatherings that we started implementing last week will be one factor. Another factor that could come into play is the increase in movement and activities fueled by growing anticipation of a return to normal.
Now, earlier in the day, Health Minister Kwon Deok-chol also mentioned with the rebound to close to 2,000 infections, we should especially be vigilant at this point before the government's planned return to normalcy, the scheme starting in November. So going back to the factors attributing to the rise in cases, officials say that movement in general, as well as movement traced to culture and leisure activities, have been on the upward trend recently, along with increase in consumption. Now, those are welcoming developments in terms of the country's aim to revive the domestic economy, they say, but increase the risks of coronavirus transmissions. What's also adding to concerns is the dropping temperature, with more citizens bound to gather at indoor places. Authorities also renewed calls for vigilance this weekend with Halloween coming up, frequent ventilation, staying at indoor venues as short as possible, wearing face masks, and refraining from gatherings, especially if you're unvaccinated, were some points made this Wednesday.
Right. And so I understand authorities have also announced stern measures against violations of our current social distancing guidelines.
Right. They have been making those announcements since last week with Halloween coming up. But the government, Sunny, made clear today that the inspections at places where a lot of foreigners reside, and as well as the warning of deportation in case foreigners violate social distancing measures, that this is not aimed at targeting foreigners, but according to an official, Son Young-hae, earlier, Halloween just happens to be celebrated among many foreigners. So he just wanted to make that clear, that it's not targeted at foreigners.
Right, well, that is good to know, of course. Now, so there are expectations that testings will surge once social distancing measures are eased. And I understand an official had something to say regarding this expectation earlier today.
Right. Son actually said he does not expect an explosive need for COVID-19 screenings when a vaccine pass is introduced, and citing the high vaccination rate here in the country. Son said, first and foremost, the government is planning to expand PCR tests once we shift into the phased return to normalcy scheme, and that the possibility of people having to pay for such tests is an option in the long run when the demand for the tests is monitored during the first and second phase of our return to pre-pandemic lives. He added, already more than 90% of those aged above 60 and close to 90% of those aged 50 and above have been fully vaccinated. Also, in 3 to 4 weeks, he forecasts some 90% of those in their 20s to 40s to be fully vaccinated. Meanwhile, he also added that a delay in the introduction of the vaccine pass is not in discussion, because that question has been raised since we have been now hitting over 1,900 infections today. So not a delay, but other discussions will be made, including the implementation plans for living with the virus will be discussed at a committee that is in charge of making these plans to return to our daily lives. And that committee will hold its third meeting, that is this Thursday.
Right, and probably you'll bring us updates.
This Wednesday, that is.
Right, on this Wednesday,
yes,
then?
Later this afternoon.
Right. Well, while Korea is just rolling out its vaccine pass, a number of countries over in Europe have been rolling them out for quite a bit now, for quite a while, that is. And despite that reality, the vaccine passes remain a source of much contention within members of the public. And for more on that, I have Min Jung back here in the studio. Of course, Min Jung, tell us more about the discontentment overseas with regard to vaccine passes.
Sure. So since summer, many European countries have mandated the submission of a vaccine pass or a negative PCR test for access to high-risk to public venues, and this has been controversial ever since. If you look at France, people are not allowed to enter indoor facilities like restaurants, cafes, theaters, and fitness centers without a vaccine pass. And the same goes for countries like Germany, Switzerland, and Italy. In fact, Italy has imposed one of the world's strictest vaccine mandates for the workplace. Italians can only go to work if they have the pass, and failure to do so can lead to a suspension of their employment without pay. Some people do acknowledge, however, that while the measures are harsh, they are necessary. But there are others who are voicing strong opposition against these mandates, citing it as a violation of their freedom and discrimination. In major cities across France and Italy, protests have broken out almost every weekend since July. In Switzerland, people there will hold a referendum next month to decide the fate of the country's COVID-19 certificate.
Right, I see. Meanwhile, so back here on the local front, we are bound to see some level of hostility against vaccine passes once it is put into practice, right?
Right, Sunny. It's going to be impossible to vaccinate 100% of the nation's population. So even if it is a minority, there will be people who will be against vaccinations and thus against the introduction of vaccine passes. Now, it's not as bad going to be like in other countries where vaccination rates are much lower and where there is a higher antipathy towards vaccines. So with that, I just want to go back to some figures that I mentioned earlier in the program when I talked about the death toll in Russia, Ukraine, and Bulgaria. So these countries had Russia over 1,100 deaths, and Ukraine more than 730, and Bulgaria more than 240 deaths that were reported on a Tuesday local time. And those have 33%, 16%, and 25% respectively fully vaccinated their citizens. So that really shows that the death toll gets higher if you have less people vaccinated. So going back to what an official at Wednesday's briefing here in Korea said, there are certain factors that should alleviate concerns over discrimination against vaccinated people. Let's take a listen.
In many other parts of the world, vaccine passes have been primarily used to control access in restaurants and cafes. But we'll be taking a different approach of limiting the number of unvaccinated people who are present in a certain venue at any given time. So the measures we're reviewing do not completely shut access to restaurants and cafes for certain people.
Now, what Korea's government is stressing here is that regarding verification of vaccinations and also PCR tests, it is adopting such a system on a temporary basis and also for high-risk venues only, rather than the broad implementation that is seen in many other countries abroad.
Right, so it is temporary to ease our transition into a new normal.
Yes, of course.
All right, so thank you very much for that. And Minjung, I'll see you back here on Thursday.
Thank you.
Foreign Minister Chung Eui-yong is meeting with his Russian counterpart Sergei Lavrov on this Wednesday in Moscow. Their talks will cover bilateral ties as well as possible paths to better promoting the peace process on the Korean peninsula. The two officials are also poised to attend a cultural event commemorating 30 years of their diplomatic ties. Chung's trip to Russia follows Lavrov's trip to Seoul back in March. Seoul and Washington see eye to eye on the importance of diplomatic engagement with Pyongyang, but the two sides may differ on the prerequisites for an end-of-war declaration on the Korean peninsula. Our Kim Dami has more on this outlook from the U.S.
Washington appears to be taking a rather cautious stance when it comes to Seoul's proposed end of Korean War declaration, saying that South Korea and the U.S. may have somewhat different perspectives on the precise timing or conditions for different steps. U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan said this on Tuesday when asked how seriously the White House is considering President Moon Jae-in's recent proposal. While refraining from getting into the topic publicly, Sullivan made sure to note that Seoul and Washington are fundamentally aligned on the need to engage with the regime diplomatically.
The two sides have different opinions on the content, extent, and timing of the end-of-war declaration and are in the process of narrowing those differences.
In fact, Seoul and Washington have been closely discussing how to bring the North back to the dialogue table, with U.S. nuclear envoy Sung Kim visiting Seoul just last weekend to speak with his South Korean counterpart, Roh Tae-woo. Another expert adds that it's not surprising that the two might have different viewpoints.
The end-of-war declaration satisfies South Korea's national interest, but from the U.S. point of view, it will be a moment to contemplate the readjustment of American military power in Northeast Asia, such as the status of U.S. forces in Korea.
But he further pointed out Seoul's proposal is clearly an attractive suggestion to Washington, as it could secure peace on the Korean peninsula and become a starting point to resolve the North's nuclear issues. Washington is yet to officially release the details on the end-of-war declaration proposal. The North Korean leader's sister Kim Yo-jong last month called the offer a, quote, interesting idea, while demanding an end to what she called hostile policy toward the regime. Kim Dami, Arirang News.
Meanwhile, the U.S. has sought a virtual engagement with its ASEAN counterparts at the presidential level for the first time in 4 years, following former President Donald Trump's last meeting with the regional bloc back in 2017. Our Kim Hyo-sun has more on President Joe Biden's diplomatic efforts.
On Tuesday, U.S. President Joe Biden took part in a virtual summit with the leaders of ASEAN for the first time in 4 years that Washington has engaged at the top level with the regional bloc. This comes as President Biden is seeking to intensify U.S. presence in the Pacific as China continues to emerge as a national security and economic adversary. Biden said his administration plans to provide up to $102 million to the bloc for regional development, stressing that Washington's relationship with ASEAN is a linchpin for maintaining resilience, prosperity, and the security of the region.
In fact, we intend to launch a new program and initiatives to enhance our cooperation across the range of issues, totaling more than $100 million. Our bottom line is that ASEAN is essential. I want to say that is essential to the regional architecture of the Indo-Pacific.
The fund will include spending for health and welfare, a new climate initiative, as well as other programs to help ASEAN countries recover from the pandemic. Myanmar was not allowed to attend as the group banned its military junta leader for ignoring the bloc's roadmap for peace that was agreed upon 6 months ago. However, the other leaders shared their concerns over Myanmar's worsening crisis. President Biden denounced a military coup for its use of, quote, horrific violence against protesters. He added the U.S. will focus on sending support for the people of Myanmar for its democratic path, as well as for the protection of safety, security, and human rights. On Wednesday, President Biden will join the broader East Asia Summit, which brings together ASEAN and other nations in the Indo-Pacific region. Kim Yo-san, Arirang News.
Back on the local front, a state funeral will be held for former President Roh Tae-woo, who passed away at the age of 88 earlier on Tuesday. The announcement was made at a cabinet meeting on Wednesday, presided over by Prime Minister Kim Buk-yeom, who claimed that Roh, the 13th president of South Korea, had seen over a number of national achievements during his term in office. The decision for a state funeral follows cabinet talks amid negative public sentiment over Roh's involvement in a military crackdown against pro-democracy activities. Meanwhile, the funeral home at Seoul National University Hospital has opened up a room for people to pay their respects to the late former President Roh Tae-woo. Starting at 10 a.m., prominent figures, including SK Chairman Choi Tae-won, who is also the son-in-law of Roh, were among the visitors. Politicians from across the political divide were also there to extend their condolences, mostly leaving short comments on Roh's achievements, adding that now was not a time for criticism. And Korea is actively working to ease its carbon footprints, and in its latest endeavor to this end, the country has unveiled the world's largest hydrogen fuel cell power plant. Our Kim Sung-min was there.
The clock is ticking for South Korea as it aims to slash its 700 million tons of carbon emissions a year to net zero by 2050. And this newly built hydrogen fuel cell power plant by Korea Southern Power Company is expected to play a key role. Currently, this is the biggest of its kind in the world. Marking the completion of the plant, the company on Tuesday held a ceremony pledging its full support for the country's green transition by providing a stable source of clean energy.
The goal of net zero by 2050 is our ultimate path. We aim to transform ourselves into a green energy company by expanding the portion of renewable energy to as much as 70% in the coming 3 decades.
Located in the western part of Incheon, the plant can generate 700 gigawatt-hours of electricity a year, enough to power some 250,000 households in the capital area. And around 44,000 homes will get heat from the plant. What's most remarkable about the plant, though, is that it creates almost no harmful byproducts and actually purifies the air. They say enough for close to 1 million people to breathe in a day. It also contributed to the hydrogen economy more widely in Korea, as almost all the materials to build the plant were sourced from local companies.
At 80 megawatts, we have completed the world's largest fuel cell power plant with equipment supplied by Doosan PureCell. We believe this has done a great deal to grow the local hydrogen sector.
With the new plant as a start, Korea's Southern Power Company and its parent company KEPCO say they plan to expand the hydrogen power business to other parts of the country, including Busan and beyond to the global market. Kim Sung-min, Arirang News.
Surging prices of homes here in Korea are marking a slowdown. This is according to Finance Minister Hong Nam-gi on Wednesday at a related meeting where he linked the slowdown that reportedly began in September to greater supply, higher interest rates and tougher borrowing conditions. Hong also said a plan on public housing unit pre-subscriptions will be shared in November. In other news, Korea continues to witness the shaping of a rather worrying demographic portrait. Fewer babies are being born while more people are passing away. Our Min Suk-hyun reports.
The number of births in South Korea has dropped once more, declining on-year for 69 consecutive months. Statistics Korea said on Wednesday that the number of newborns in August stood at 22,291, down 0.5% from a year earlier. This is the lowest figure for any month of August since data was first compiled in 1981. The country also reported its highest number of deaths for the month of August since records began. More than 25,800 deaths were recorded in August, up 2.1% from the same month last year. The number of deaths has continued to outnumber births for 22 straight months. The number of marriages in August also hit a record low of 14,720, down 2.1% on year. The fall was attributed to a population decline in people in their 30s as well as to the COVID-19 pandemic. Strict social distancing rules and a ban on gatherings led many couples to push back their wedding dates. Statistics Korea added that the number of marriages has been declining since 2012. Meanwhile, the number of divorces plunged 0.9% on year to over 8,300 cases. Min Suk-hyun, Arirang News.
The growing appetite for Korea's ramyeon overseas is taking our instant noodles to the next level on the back of global popularity of Korean dramas, music and movies. In fact, sales abroad of some ramyeon brands have surpassed their sales here in the domestic market. Do take a look.
Delicious, cheap, easy to cook, ramyons are all-time favorite food to a lot of people. And South Korea, in fact, is leading the world in instant noodle consumption, eating about 80 packages per year on average. And this Korean soul food is gaining much popularity overseas.
Yes, today we are going to explore Korean instant noodles.
Yes, or we call it also.
An Australian YouTuber explains the taste of various Korean ramyeon.
It's a 9 out of 10. It's really good.
It is quite easy to find foreigners trying Korean ramyeon on YouTube. This came as the popularity of Korean ramyeon increased sharply worldwide, going beyond Korea. In fact, overseas sales of Shinramyeon, a leading brand of instant noodles in Korea, exceeded domestic sales for the first time since its launch in 1986. Half of the overseas sales were from the United States and China, and sales in other parts of the world, including Southeast Asia, Europe, and Australia, also shoot up. As for Samyang Ramyeon, its overseas sales already surpassed that of Korea back in 2019. And as of the first half of this year, overseas sales took up 57% of the total sales.
지금 아무래도 이제 재택근무하면서 집에서 먹은 걸 소비하다 보니까 이제 밀키트라든지 이런 배달 음식 시장 수요가 폭발적으로 증가했고요. 그러면서 이제 K-라면이라는 이제 장르가 이제 굉장히 각광을 받게 됐는데 컵라면 같은 이제 용기도 다양화되고 가격대도 다양화되면서 라면 시장 자체가 이제 굉장히 볼륨감 있게 사이즈업을 한 시장으로 성장하고 있고요.
One of the main reasons for the soaring popularity of Korean ramyeon is the rise of home cooking after COVID-19. According to trade data, ramyeon exports in March 2020, when the pandemic broke out, increased by 40% compared to the same period the year before, reaching $53 million. Korean ramyeon is known for its unique, spicy taste, which definitely differentiates it from other Asian instant noodles from the beginning of its overseas expansion.
감사합니다. Well, ramyeon was already one of the top export items even before COVID-19, though. Thanks to the rise of K-culture, now foreigners began enjoying Korean ramyeon.
Last year, Dongsim, a South Korean food company, reached its record high in export after Chapaguri, a mixture of two famous Dongsim ramyons, garnered global popularity after being prominently featured in the Oscar-winning film Parasite. Meanwhile, Samyang Food hopes for a boon from featuring in South Korean hit show Squid Game after its signature ramyeon stole a scene in the drama.
이 오징어 게임을 통해서 여러 가지 지금 한국 문화가 지금 세계로 지금 알려지고 있거든요. 또 그게 식품도 끼어 있고요. 그런 면에서 식품 수출이 많아지고 한다는 것은 단순한 경제적 가치를 넘어서서 민간 외교적인 측면에서 성과가 나타날 수가 있다. 이렇게 볼 수가 있겠습니다.
With the fast-growing popularity and success of ramyun, South Korean instant noodle companies are expanding their global presence. Nongshim plans to open its second factory in the United States later this year. Samyang, on the other hand, had opened an American subsidiary in Los Angeles in August 2020 and plans to launch its new office in Shanghai, China in December this year.
전 세계 지금 30억 명의 정도 달하는 전 세계 MZ 세대는 한국을 굉장히 프리미엄으로 인식하고 있고요. 그래서 한국의 문화를 체험하고 싶고 한국을 방문하고 싶어하고 한국의 음식을 체험하고 싶어하는데 한국 음식을 체험할 수 있는 가장 낮은 단계의 엔트리 제품이 라면인 것 같아요.
Gen MZ, the main consumer of the food industry and who values special experience, is now leading the world in K-food popularity.
It seems the cheap go-to meal for almost all Koreans will soon win over instant noodle lovers around the world. This has been 신새벽.
Charting a new normal amid COVID-19 includes the adoption of innovative working arrangements to allow for greater level of productivity and a stronger sense of reward. So what are the options out there? To answer this question, I have Professor Yang Hee-dong from Ewha Women's University. Welcome back, Professor Yang.
Thank you for inviting me.
Right, and joining this session virtually is Professor Marlon Twyman at the University of Southern California. It's a pleasure to have you with us, Professor Twyman.
Yeah, thank you, Sunny. Happy to be here.
Right. Professor Yang, we'll start here in the studio then. Let's begin with efforts by companies here and elsewhere to adapt their working environment to COVID-19 strategies, exit strategies, that is.
Yeah, I mean, there are many interesting instances and the cases about the telecommuting. The working from home, whether, wherever you stay, it's called as telecommuting. And here's a very interesting announcement by World Economic Forum recently. And they had a survey about the preference of telecommuting for the laborers. And they found that more than 60% of laborers prefer the telecommuting. The majority of people, I mean, they, instead of working in the traditional offline office, they prefer to work at home. And examples include most of big IT companies such as Amazon, Apple, Microsoft, all those IT firms, do care about the productivity rather than the ways how their employees and laborers, come to work in the office. And the most interesting example is PwC, the global consulting firm. And they announced, actually they instructed to the employees that they can work anywhere in the world. And they can come to office at maximum 3 times a month. But this condition will be applied only to the back office administrators. In other words, if you have to face with the customers, I mean, you are, accepted from this instruction. Of course, there are the antagonists about this idea. For example, Netflix, Reed Hastings, one of very respected CEO, he doesn't like the idea of telecommuting. So I know that there are some pros and cons of these issues and advocates or the antagonists of the telecommuting, but I should say that the majority of the companies, prefer this idea. And let me add one more survey, presented by Morgan Stanley, and they found that more than 69% of American firms prefer telecommuting.
Right. Right then, Professor Twyman, as Professor Yang has mentioned, pundits do agree that the pandemic has dramatically transformed global working patterns, including corporate culture. Would you like to elaborate on that first?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And just to piggyback on some of the ideas that have been brought up so far, I think one of the main cultural shifts we're starting to see is really this notion of flexibility on behalf of the employer and giving the employees or the laborers a lot more agency and autonomy in how they choose to get their work done. So, for example, this looks like not only just the telecommuting aspect, but also how they'll be working, whether that's asynchronously or by themselves, mostly through emails when they do need to communicate, or whether or not they'll have a lot more rhythmic communication that happens throughout the day. And from what I've seen, just based on my research and in the United States, it appears that there's a lot of momentum actually to supporting workers who choose to adopt this lifestyle moving forward as we continue to live with the pandemic.
Professor Tae-woo, what has been the general response to remote working among members of the public in the U.S.?
In general, I would say the response has been mixed, and that basically seems to be coming from the type of industry that the worker themselves are a part of. So, for example, for those IT workers, a lot of them have relocated, moved out of urban environments to a lot more spacious or rural areas to enjoy more lifestyle changes, rather. However, there are other industries where employees are actually looking forward to being in more dialogue, constant communication, have a higher range of interactivity in their work with their colleagues, as seen through the common office interactions. So there's actually a great deal of variability there. And there are a lot of big organizations that are trying to effectively decide what works best for their business models.
Right. Meanwhile, Professor Yang, back here in Korea, according to the Bank of Korea, hybrid working arrangements will be the new normal on the local front as we move beyond this pandemic. Do you share this outlook?
Yes, I do agree. Well, before we talk about the hybrid mode of working, we need to understand the flexible, the working programming. Flexible work programming means you can choose your working hours anytime, according to your contract. So you can start to work like at 10 a.m., 11 a.m., it's up to you. And out of this, the flexible time workers, about 68% of people prefer to work for the telecommuting. That's the case in the U.S. But in Korea, this preference stays quite lower, such as 5% about 2 years ago. But now this ratio has increased to 17.4% last year. That means more than 5 times has been increased for the Korean workers who prefer to work, through the telecommuting with the flexible, the working hours. The BBC also announced a very recent survey that more than 72% of the British workers prefer in hybrid mode. I mean, this number is quite surprising because only 12% of British people prefer to work in the traditional way, working in the offline places. So, but the major issue with this, trend towards hybrid mode of working, it depends on the culture and the philosophy of the CEOs. Because in Korea, well, we will get back to this later on, but it's quite tough in terms of the culture. I mean, even though you may have a solid reason and regulations or policy within your organization, you have to take a look at it, consider others, the impression about your attitudes of working. So, I mean, you can control over this culture by any instructions or policy or whatever. But still remains as very, very critical factor to promote the telecommuting with the flexible working hours. But that is a very, very general trend in Korea. You can ignore it.
Right. So widespread application or adoption of the hybrid working arrangement, online and offline, mixed together, is not likely in the country then in the near future.
Well, it may take time again because this is a matter of culture. It's not just to snap your fingers and you just start to work the flexible hours and stay at home and talking to your boss through email or whatever. It just takes time.
Right. Now, for the sake of a comparison, then, Professor Tae-woo, what can you tell us about the long-term prospects of working patterns in the U.S. as the U.S. learns to live with COVID-19?
Yeah, so I'm loving this conversation because what we're seeing in the United States is there's a lot more just positive reception on behalf of the actual employees at imagining what their lives could look like outside of that office on a typical 5-day work week. So we are seeing more companies adopt the hybrid strategy formally, sometimes on the order of, say, 3 times a week in person, others moving towards just once a month, whereas even some government agencies for the first time ever actually moving toward a fully remote model, which they have rejected for a long time. And I think what's really interesting here in the United States is that our technological advancements with respect to workplace monitoring and task management, as well as just simple awareness or surveillance of the employee productivity, has helped move along a lot of these more positive receptions where workers are now feeling as though, hey, you know when I'm logged in, you know when I'm working, I've made my availability transparent to you, the employer. I'm getting my work done. Let's continue to move forward in a productive manner and just really save time and energy from the commute and put that into my labor for the company. And then in the long term, I do agree also that it is culturally, not every organization will choose to adopt a fully remote or even a hybrid strategy for their employees' work, but that's really going to be an idiosyncratic choice, mostly driven by the competitive landscape in a given industry.
Right, of course. Professor Yang, there are no doubt trade-offs for companies that choose to maintain remote working. For example, potential exposure to cybercrimes or perhaps a creativity crisis, if I may, owing to reduced interpersonal collaboration between among workers, that is. And yet some employers are considering this option of remote working. Why do you suppose this is the case?
Well, there are many reasons, depending on or impact on the effectiveness of this remote working or telecommuting. The first one is it's really up to the characteristics of the work. As already mentioned, the IT, is a very representative example where remote working or telecommuting can work very well because most of the programs are operating in modules. So once you take care of your own modules, all these individual modules will work and supposed to collaborate through the outputs out of this module. You don't care about the inside of the other modules. And this offer characteristic impact on the way they do they count on their work because each other's you don't care about each other's the work process or work attitude. But I think I need to cite the research by Nicholas Bloom of Stanford University about the advantages or disadvantages of remote work. Well, the positive aspects include on the reduction of the costs from the perspective of the enterprises. So, for example, we can reduce about 20 or 30% of your working offices. And also, the employees can enhance their productivity because you can enjoy your own free time, you can control over your working pace, and you can enhance your concentration, right? And also, the Nicholas mentioned that this increase in personal productivity will up to 20 or 30%. But negative aspects are also very, very numerous. For example, you can lose the focus on your work because you have so many distractions in your home. Particularly if you're mothers of two very pranky, twins or kids, you'll be in big trouble. And also, it'd be very, very tough to coordinate the collaborations or communications, particularly through, your boss's order because your boss is all the time very, very busy. So of course, there are many pros and cons over this, the remote work, but we can ignore again the general trend towards in hybrid. So we need to figure out how we can increase the positive aspect, how we can reduce or eliminate the negative aspect of this, this issue.
Right, there are many tasks to be tackled then.
Right.
Professor Tae-woo, I think you mentioned this a while back, but how do you respond to concerns that remote working hamstrings productive communication?
Great question. I would say that it doesn't necessarily limit or constrain communication so much as it forces us to be a little more intentional in our communication. So a long line of historical research on computer-mediated communication has pointed out how the relative lack of richness of digital communication really puts one at an information disadvantage compared to face-to-face, really just more in-person conversations. However, what we're seeing through the just plethora of now available technologies between social media, instant messaging apps, how much interactivity is available through video conferencing or video call software, we're seeing a lot of that richness being restored to digital communication. And what this means is now the employees or the workers, while they might lose the spontaneity or just the random kind of dialogues that could happen from disruptive or interruptions to their work, they have more control over when they engage. And in a lot of cases, they're not necessarily missing out on that same level of richness that we can find in more in-person, in-office settings.
Right. Professor Yang, Professor Twyman mentioned this, but given the relative flexibility offered by remote working, do you suppose this reality may perhaps offer women greater working opportunities?
Well, I should be more careful in making any conclusions, because there's a very interesting report that over 1/3 of the remote workers are burnt out. That means there should be some stress from the inside of the home, right? They may deteriorate the work productivity, for the remote workers. For example, over the 80% of the women, feel more precious about their home affairs if they work in remote, they work in their home. And so I think there are two major pressures for this burnout, and the more pressures for the female workers, for the remote workers. The first one is this pressure comes from the employers of the company. So the more kids these women have, and the smaller these kids are, the more likely they will receive any, the pressures from the top, such as leave of absence or even the layoff, whatever. So they are exposed to restructuring under the execution of, improving the productivity or the reducing, costs or whatever. And the second pressure for the female remote workers comes from inside the family, because in Korean culture, home affairs are the realm for the females rather than for the males. So unless these female remote workers earn great support or cooperation or collaboration from their spouses, and they will be really stressed out, even more from this remote working. So we need we need to figure out both of outside and inside the pressures that may deteriorate the quality and productivity of the female remote workers.
Right, and staying with that, Professor Twyman, a clear downside, of course, of working at home, as mentioned by Professor Yang, is the blurry boundary between one's personal and professional lives. In fact, a greater number of people, as Professor Yang has clearly said, reported that they experienced, that is, burnouts amid the pandemic more than pre-pandemic times. What do you propose then to address this unfortunate repercussion of remote working?
So I think one of the biggest consequences of what we've learned as a global society is that no one really has a good idea of whose responsibility it is to ensure work-life balance and really maintaining the health of the worker. But this is a great time to have the conversation. Overall, I would say we're now entering into an era where a lot of people have had to reconfigure their living spaces to accommodate their work, right? They've maybe had to convert a bedroom or reorient their primary living room in a way that they did not anticipate and in a way that they did not want. And where this becomes an issue is that there have been many working adults in the white-collar professions who have chosen to adopt a work-from-home lifestyle and have done that for years, even without the need caused by the COVID-19 pandemic. But those are people who opted into or wanted that way of living. It wasn't forced upon them like we've seen for a vast majority of work-from-home workers since the pandemic started. And so these are people who have had to make very real adjustments. As my colleague here has said on the broadcast, we also have people who have had to manage or balance childcare while simultaneously working due to restrictions or mandates with respect to the availability of child and family care. And so what we're seeing with respect to burnout is simply the result of a way of working in largely an emergency situation being forced upon a large group of people who have had limited access to support. And we need to be having this conversation around who's responsible for providing such support and when is this going to happen.
Right. And moving slightly beyond offline and online working, Professor Yang, what are your thoughts then on the adoption of 4 working days as opposed to 5, perhaps as a possible solution to remedy the burnout experienced by some of the workers?
Yeah, I mean, there are already many countries that apply 4-day work per week, such as Iceland and Finland and New Zealand and Scotland. Even the Scotland government has prepared about $60 million to support the companies if they apply for their work, the schedule for the employees. But I need to make a couple of comments on this issue. The first one is, we already talked about the work-life balance, particularly for the female, the remote workers. And here's a very interesting research, published by the Claudia Goldin of Harvard University. And she mentioned that the greedy work is a major reason for the gap pay, gender pay gap. In other words, greedy work means like you overwork or working the weekends. They used to be dominated by the males because, again, home affairs, particularly in the nighttime or weekends, are the jobs of the females. So, and then she, insisted that this greedy work should be shared between different genders or different people. And a good example is the American pharmacist. They equally share this kind of greedy work, overwork with all the employees. The pay rate is pretty similar. So that could be one of the way to apply or implement the 4-day work program. In other words, if we share extra work or particularly during the busy season, we can apply for their work schedules. And another one is this is from even the government perspective. This is a very, very effective way to decrease your unemployment rate. I mean, this month and last month our unemployment rate went down to 2 points, whereas we used to have over the 5% in this January. What's the trick to reduce the unemployment rate? This kind of mode, there is employing more people to share greedy work and hard work. That could be the best way, not just to implement 4-day working period in the program, but also to reduce our unemployment rate.
Right, reduce working hours and reducing our workload then.
Right, I'm absolutely in favor of that, the program, that vision.
Professor Tae-woo, let's end with a few words from you for employers and employees in general as we shift to diverse working arrangements amid our efforts to coexist with COVID-19.
Yeah, thank you. Compassion is key, people. This is something that we're all learning to navigate, a largely uncertain climate with respect to public health, what it means for the economy writ large, and both employees and employers. I think compassion will go a long way. Checking in with colleagues, whether or not they're supervisors or subordinates, just being willing to tolerate, say, a late deliverable that may not necessarily be mission critical, and just offering support for people, because you never know who's been directly affected by some of these very major issues that a vast majority of us are navigating. And so that's what I would say, compassion for your colleagues. We spend a lot of time with each other and try to keep the positivity.
Right. I think remote working makes some people realize that they do miss working with their colleagues inside the office as well. All right, Professor Tae-woo, thank you very much for your kind words. And Professor Yang here in the studio, thank you for your time today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Right. Well, some people claim sometimes the world is hit with a crisis in order to provide it with an opportunity. Having said that, we hope you're making the most of current efforts to chart a new normal. Thank you for watching.